There have been two extremely consequential elections, national elections, in two very important countries, or at least relatively important countries. One that was held in the UK, and that was a general election that happened because the Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, was nearing the end of the period where he would be required to call for general elections. The person elected and becomes prime minister of the party has a 5-year term. That term was ending at the end of this year, but polls showed his party well behind the Labour Party. His party is the Tories, the Conservatives, who have run Britain for the last 14 years. And for a bunch of different strategic reasons, he believed that it would be advantageous to call those elections a few months earlier than he had to at the end of the year. And so he called elections. There's a 6-week I believe, election period from the time the prime minister calls until the actual vote. And the UK had its general election last week. And the headline was that the Labour Party, the center-left establishment Labour Party, experienced some great victory or some major resurgence. And while it's true that the Labour Party did end up with an absolute majority in the parliament, and the Conservatives or the Tory party collapsed, when you look at the actual data, which I think is very important to do, you will see that this was far from some sort of surge of support for the Labour Party. In fact, all of the available data, which we'll go over with you in a minute, shows the exact opposite, that in fact, voters of the UK now hate both of the two parties that represent status quo establishment politics, including Labour and the Conservatives. And even though Labour ended up with something like 65% of the seats in Parliament, they only got, that party, 34% of the vote of all voters. 34% of voters in the UK voted for the Labour Party. They got fewer votes, just over 9 million, than they got 4 years ago in the general election, or 5 years actually ago, when they were led by Jeremy Corbyn, when they got 10 million votes. And there was another national election held 2 years prior to that in 2017, also the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, where they got 11 million votes. So the Labour Party, far from getting this huge victory, actually got fewer votes, which we'll show you in a minute, than they have. And the thing that has gone up the most are non-voters, people so disgusted with the political system that they actually don't want to vote. And then you have the French elections over the weekend, which we had several experts to discuss in advance of it. And that happened because there were elections for the EU Parliament, and Marine Le Pen's right-wing party got by far the most amount of votes in that election for the EU Parliament. And as a result, Emmanuel Macron, despite not needing to at all, decided he would dissolve Parliament, where his party had a majority of the vote, of the seats, and the handpicked successor he chose, Gabriel Attal, this young gay Macronist who had been prime minister of the French Parliament, he dissolved those elections. He dissolved the parliament and decided to have new elections. And for a long time, it looked as though Marine Le Pen's party would end up with certainly the most amount of votes, if not an absolute majority. As it turned out, that did not happen. The right-wing party of Marine Le Pen came in third place. Macron came in second. And a coalition of left-wing parties, led by what you could call a pretty far-left personality, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, ended up winning the election. None of those factions, none of those three has anywhere near a majority. And so it's extremely unclear how France will be governed in their parliament, and whether the Macronists will support a left-wing candidate to be the prime minister. It looks unlikely that the right will now have as a prime minister, but France is basically in paralysis because, again, voters turned against the centrist establishment politics of Emmanuel Macron, and as a result turned either to the left or to the right. And this is the thing that we're seeing over and over in the democratic world. You can get different outcomes at different times for specific reasons relating to the moment in which the election is held or the specific country. But the trend over and over in every one of these elections is growing disgust and contempt for status quo politics, for the establishment institutions of the West that run the lives of people in Europe and the United States and Canada. and throughout the democratic world. And these two elections, despite the kind of top line headline, oh, Labor surges to a landslide victory, or Macron vindicated in his choice to try and keep the far right out of power, end up telling very much the same story. So first of all, let's go to the UK, where this election can pretty much be understood in a single chart. And this is the vote share of every party from 1970 until the election that was just held in 2024. Now, if you look at any newspaper headline, you will see Labor wins by a landslide. And there is a sense in which you can justify that. As I said, they got 65% of the seats in Parliament, an absolute majority. As a result, the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, one of the most uninspiring, vacant, and belief-free, craven politicians you will ever see in your entire life, was elevated to the prime ministership. He's now the prime minister of the UK because the Labour Party has a majority seats of the Parliament. But if you look at this chart, which is the percentage of the vote in every election from 1970 until the one that was just held, the line that represents the Labour Party is this red line here. Red is the color of Labour. And you can see it there. They had this uptick in percentage right here. That was in 2017 when the party was under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. You see the line went straight up when they had a much more aggressive anti-establishment left-wing populist politics. And then under Keir Starmer, you see it drop all the way to here. So this is the current vote total of the Labour Party. It's actually one of the lowest levels that they've ever had in their history. At the same time, you can take a look at the Conservative Party, which is the Tory party that ruled for the last 14 years under people like David Cameron and Theresa May and Boris Johnson, and then a couple of people they quickly circulated through, including Liz Truss, who was the prime minister for about 46 days and almost destroyed single-handedly the British economy. Here you see the Tory party, the Conservative Tory party, which is easily the most important and dominant party in British politics in its recent history. And you can see that their trend is they had a huge collapse. They went from this level here ahead of the Labour Party in 2019, and they just completely collapsed because what this election was about more than anything was discussed with the Conservative Party, with the Tories, for good reason. Not only were they in power for 14 years and therefore the symbols of the status quo, they did the sorts of thing in office that deservedly provoked the disgust of almost everybody, regardless of political affiliation. Probably their most harmful scandal was that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, through the next year and a half, the British government under Boris Johnson, implemented some of the harshest and most suffocating stay-at-home and curfew and lockdown rules of any country in the democratic world. People were barred from even going outside. They were not able to gather in groups. A lot of people lost their family members and weren't able to go to funerals. And yet it turned out that the whole time, the leaders of the Conservative Party and the UK government were having major raucous parties inside 10 Downing Street, where they all were on top of each other every night, just violating all of the COVID protocols they had imposed on the entire population. When they got caught, they repeatedly lied about it. And then by the time there was an investigation, everyone realized that they had done that Boris Johnson had lied, and Boris Johnson was forced to leave office, despite a pretty resounding victory. And from there, they just had one scandal after the next. Again, not an ideological scandal, but just sleaze and corruption of the kind voters hated. So you can see here this election had nothing to do with British voters turning to the center-left Labour Party. In fact, they're as unpopular as ever, even though they won a majority. What happened was a collapse of the Conservative Party because they were the party in power. This was an anti-establishment, anti-status quo vote. And I think the most important part of what this chart shows is that this gray line is by far the highest, and you see this huge increase in that gray line. Gray line represents people who just refused to vote. It was 40%. So 40% of the British population, only one other point was it higher after 2000, was the British public just of the opinion that none of these parties was worth voting for. That was the only huge increase, huge shoot in this line. With one exception, and you can see it here, this purple line that had a very sharp incline, and that is the party of Nigel Farage and the Reform Party that focuses on hardcore anti-immigration policies, on populist right-wing policies. And they had a sharp increase in the vote total, even though they had no party structure, because the Reform Party is this brand new party. He used to have a different party called UKIP, and they're also part of this chart here. And they had this big surge. They were the popular party during Brexit, but then they kind of disbanded. And then Nigel Farage came back during this election saying the Conservative Party had failed us, had abandoned all of our anti-establishment politics, and they took a huge amount from the Conservative Party. They had an increase of millions of people who voted for Nigel Farage's Reform Party, took away a lot of votes from Conservatives, but also a lot of people who had previously been in the Labour Party. It was this kind of right-wing populism focused on immigration and jobs that is rapidly becoming a more and more popular ideology across all of Europe. So you can just see this tells the real story of what the actual population thinks. There was a little bit of an increase for the Green Party, this kind of centrist party called the Liberal Democrats. Didn't really have a huge increase in vote total, but they ended up getting something like 71 seats in Parliament just because of strategic expenditures of resources. But in terms of the population, the only thing you can say is that they hate anyone associated with the status quo and with the establishment, including both the Conservative Party, this establishment center-right Tory party, and the center-left Labour Party. And it's very important to see the UK election for what it actually is, rather than what the headlines were leading a lot of people to believe. Now, just to show you a little bit of more detail about this, here is the Labour Party's vote total in the last 3 elections. There you see in 2017, under Jeremy Corbyn, who's a populist, anti-establishment, left-wing leader, they got 12,800,000 votes, almost 13 million votes in 2017 under Corbyn. In 2019, in the general election under Corbyn, where the Tories won by a big majority under Boris Johnson, the Labour Party got 10,200,000 votes. And we always heard that, oh, Corbyn was a disaster for the Labour Party. He drove the Labour Party into the ground. He drove everybody away with his left-wing populist policies. But if you compare the vote total that Labour got under Corbyn in the last 2 elections to the vote total that Keir Starmer just got in 2024, you see that the vote total has been declining for the Labour Party, and that if you compare what the Labour Party got in 2017 under Corbyn to what Keir Starmer just got with the Labour Party in this last election, the one where Labour supposedly had a huge landslide victory, you see that in that time, Labour has lost 3 million votes, from basically 13 million to 9.5 million. Really, 3.5 million votes. So do not believe any narrative that suggests that this was some victory for the center-left Labour Party in any way other than the happenstance that they ended up winning the most seats in Parliament. Now, just to show you again how disparate the headlines are from the reality, here's a graph from the Financial Times, and they have 2 different columns here. This is the vote share that each party received, and here's the percentage of the seats in Parliament that they won. So you see here, Labour got 34% of the vote, as we just showed you, of the overall vote of the people of the United Kingdom, and yet they ended up with 65% of the votes in Parliament. And you might be wondering, well, how could that happen? And the reason is because a lot of countries have what's called proportional voting, where you go and vote for multiple parties, and more or less the parties end up with the percentage of seats in the parliamentary house that they receive in terms of raw vote totals. That's not how the UK holds their elections. The UK holds their elections in what's called first past the post. So you can win a constituency, which is analogous to a House district, was something like 23% of the vote total, 25% of the vote total, because the other parties divided up. And as long as you're the leading vote total, there's no runoff, there's no requirement to get 50% of the vote in a runoff, you end up winning that seat for the constituency. And Labor ended up winning so many seats with a very small vote total, in part because the Conservatives and Nigel Farage's more right-wing populist party ended up splitting so many of the votes that it enabled the Labor candidate to win with a very small percentage of votes. The Conservatives got 24% of the overall vote total and only 18% of the seats in Parliament. And then here's the really interesting thing. The Reform Party, which is Nigel Farage's party that led Brexit, that really represents his anti-establishment, hardcore right-wing politics, it got 14% of the overall vote total. Again, a brand new party. It used to be called something different. It got abandoned, UKIP. But it basically was a brand new party with no financing, no structure, no seats in the parliament, huge structural disadvantages. Despite that, it got 14% of the vote total. And yet they only ended up getting 1% of the seats in the parliament. And then here you see the Liberal Democrats got a fair 12 and 11%. The Greens got 7% of the vote total and yet 1% in the parliament. So it's only because of the system that it makes it seem like the Labour Party had some major victory, when in fact, from the perspective of what the people think, they hate the Labour Party almost as much as any other establishment party. Here just is another chart from the BBC, or rather from Al Jazeera. You see there, Labour Party got 35% of the vote, Conservative Party 24%. The Reform Party in third place with 14%. So if you add together the center-right party of the Conservative Party and the Reform Party, you end up with 38% of the vote. Now, it's not really a fair way to look at it. There was also vote splits among the left. But the idea that establishment politics or center-left politics had some grand resurgence is simply not the case. Even The Economist, a very vocal supporter these days of the Labour Party and a hardcore opponent of right-wing populism, was willing to admit that in an article this week. How shallow was Labour's victory in the British election? Quote, "The British party system may be fragmenting, but voters delivered a coherent message." Quote, "This was not a popular triumph for Labour. In absolute numbers, the party attracted fewer ballots than it did under Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. Labour's share of the vote at 34% is the lowest level for a governing party since at least the First World War. Instead of inspiring the masses, Sir Keir spearheaded a fearsomely efficient election-winning machine. It won 42 seats in parliaments for every 1 million ballots cast, higher than any other major party in the past century. It is true that Labour's victory was as much as the Conservatives' defeat. The Conservative vote collapsed by 20 percentage points, the largest decline by any governing party in British political history. Voters abandoned the party in all directions, not just for Labour, but for the Liberal Democrats, Reform UK, and the Green Party. Reform UK, a Eurosceptic and anti-immigration party led by Nigel Farage, was the biggest beneficiary of the Conservative collapse in terms of vote share. Reform UK achieved 14% of the vote nationwide, up by 12% compared with the Brexit Party, as Mr. Farage's vehicle used to be known in 2019. That was a greater share of the vote than the Lib Dems, though it translated into 67 fewer seats than Sir Ed's party. So that's the real story of what happened in the UK election. You could actually call it a victory for right-wing populism, for Eurosceptic right-wing populism, since that was the faction that had by far the greatest increase in votes despite major structural disadvantages. And now they have 4 seats in the parliament, that party does. Nigel Farage is going to be all over the media, and the probability that his party will continue to rise at the expense of not only the Conservatives, but also the Labour Party voters, who they say they're targeting precisely because a lot of Labour Party voters also hate Brussels, the EU, and massive uncontrolled immigration. They can continue to attract a large number of voters. And that really is the story of the election that exists and resides below the headline that Labour Party had some sort of grand resurgence and landslide victory. Now, France is a little bit different of a story, but more similar than different. And the reason for that is that the big question heading into the French elections was whether Marine Le Pen's party, that most French and European establishment officials regard as a far-right or even fascist party, was going to be able to replicate their success in the EU elections by winning a majority of seats in the French parliament, have their first ever prime minister in power. And Macron's view was, every time Marine Le Pen or her party gets near power, the French voters come to me. And I'm convinced that after they see this victory that Marine Le Pen had, if I dissolve the parliament and hold new elections, the French electorate will come back to me, the people, the person in the middle, the establishment figure. They'll avoid the far left, they'll avoid the far right, and I will end up winning the election. That is not what happened. It is true that the far right of Marine Le Pen, if you want to call it that, that's how it's called, ended up in third place, although they gained a lot more seats than they previously had. But the winner of the French election, by any metric, was not the centrist establishment Macron policy. It was the coalition of left-wing parties who despise Macron and who have a much more anti-Brussels, anti-EU populist politics than Macron does. And here's a chart from The Economist that just shows the pure vote totals of the French National Assembly seats after the second round of voting, which was held yesterday. Here you see the New Popular Front. That's the coalition of left-wing parties led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is absolutely a hardcore left-wing populist politician. That faction got around 180 votes in the assembly. This is the ensemble party of Emmanuel Macron. They got around 155, 160. This Macron's faction lost a huge number of votes, not as many as they looked like they were going to lose, but they lost a lot of votes. They were the majority coalition. And here's Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party that got just under 150 seats in the parliament. And so what you really have is this massive division for the first time in the history of the Fifth French Republic since World War II, where they have this party that this inability to form a majority coalition in the French National Assembly that likely is paralyzing French politics for a long time. But to me, again, the story here is that while Macron's centrist establishment politics have dominated French politics for at least the last 8 years, this election resulted in a collapse of support for his faction and a rise of support for both the populist right and the populist left. A very similar story to what we see in the UK and what we're seeing throughout all of the West. Here's the Washington Post just kind of giving a couple of bottom line facts. The Washington Post from today. A divided France enters uncharted political territory after historic vote. Quote, even as left-wing supporters were still celebrating the unexpected defeat of France's far right at the polls, attention turned Monday to the sobering task of how to govern a deeply divided country as it moves into uncharted political territory. While an alliance of leftist parties came in first with more than 180 seats, it is far from the 289 seats needed for a majority in the National Assembly, the powerful lower house of Parliament. President Emmanuel Macron's centrist Together coalition got more than 160 seats, while the far-right National Rally and its allies were third, winning 143. Polls had predicted that the far-right would come in first and perhaps even win an outright majority. Sunday's upset result could now prompt prolonged political gridlock and a, quote, new era in French politics, Macron's Prime Minister Gabriel Attal said Sunday night. He actually is the protege of Macron. He was basically chosen by Macron to become the Prime Minister. As I said, he's this young, gay Macronist who Macron thought would easily be his successor. And yet, as a result of these election results, he resigned because he no longer has a majority in the assembly. And yet, quote, Macron on Monday rejected Attal's resignation, asking him to stay for, quote, the time being to, quote, assure the stability of the country. France's divided left formed a surprising alliance in the lead up to this election to prevent a far-right victory. In part, the coalition was also forged by deep frustration with Macron. So again, it's a defeat for not the right-wing party of Marine Le Pen, who gained a lot of seats and just proved in the EU election that they have a lot more support than they ever had before. It's also clearly a victory for these left-wing populist parties. It's a defeat for the centrist establishment politics of Emmanuel Macron, just as is the case in the UK. Now, just to conclude, I want to show you a couple of segments from an interview that Marine Le Pen did last week with CNN's Christiane Amanpour, because so often these parties are deliberately misunderstood in the United States. Just like Trump's movement is often misunderstood because they're just labeled and smeared with this far-right label, which is designed to imply that they want to round up minorities and put them in camps. That's what far-right means in the history, in the context of European politics, in the context of US politics. It's designed to suggest they're sort of the successors ideologically of the Nazis, that they're far outside of the realm of anything decent or mainstream. It's designed constantly to reinforce the idea that only establishment politics, not populist politics, is acceptable. And here's Marine Le Pen in her own words in this interview with Christiane Amanpour, attempting to explain what it is that she actually believes and doesn't, and seeing Christiane Amanpour's reaction to that. Let's go ahead and play this video.
Slide.
Let me get to foreign affairs. You have in the past said things that cause people to worry about you regarding, for instance, Putin. You have talked about how, Crimea, you said it to me, was always Russian. You said the sanctions on Putin should be removed, those that were put on him for annexing Crimea and invading parts of Ukraine. Now he's fully invaded. Are you committed to the victory of Ukraine? Will France keep supporting Ukraine against this illegal invasion? Do you call it an illegal invasion? And will France...
Now, just note there how it's amazing that in order to prove that you're an acceptable politician in the West, the number one goal, the number one task that you have is to pledge support to Ukraine. The first thing Keir Starmer did, and he did it throughout the election, was say, no matter what, we are going to prove that we will stand by Ukraine until the end. When Giorgia Meloni was elected Prime Minister of Italy, they did the same thing to her that they did to Marine Le Pen. Called her a far-right fascist, a protege of Mussolini, suggested that fascism was coming to Italy, that Italian democracy was threatened. And all she had to do was one thing. In order to get the West to accept her, have the New York Times run flattering profiles on her, and that was pledge her support for the NATO war in Ukraine. And once she did that, all of those narratives disappeared. She's no longer talked about that way. And so here's Christiane Amanpour saying, you are connected to Putin. It seems like you have sympathy to Putin. And so we want to understand whether you are a decent person. And the question that she has to answer to prove she's a decent person is, will you support Ukraine against its war in Russia to the end? This is somehow the litmus test in Western politics for whether you are acceptable and decent company. And here was Marine Le Pen's answer.
Call it an illegal invasion. And will France continue to provide Ukraine with weapons to defend itself?
Madame, I think we can consider that the situation in Crimea was much more complicated than it is made out to be. But that has nothing to do with what Russia did now. What Russia has done here is violate Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, violate Ukraine's freedom, and bring war to Ukraine. From the outset, we have condemned Russia in this matter, and we have supported Ukraine throughout these 2 years, indicating that we have two red lines, which were sending French troops to Ukrainian territory, because the French are, I believe, totally opposed to this, and the delivery of long-range weapons that could hit Russia and therefore make France a co-belligerent in this conflict.
Final question.
I mean, it is unbelievable that in order to be accepted in mainstream Western establishment, political and media circles, you have to basically be indifferent to the risk of World War III. And if someone like Marine Le Pen says nothing other than, which used to be the position of the US government until it abandoned it, that the two red lines we have is we will not deploy our own country's troops in Ukraine to fight against the Russian army, nor will we authorize the use of long-range missiles by the Ukrainians to attack Russia inside Russia, because that will make our country co-belligerent in the war. Those are the two limits that we have on our willingness to get involved. And that somehow, that extremely reasonable attempt to avoid World War III and the risks of nuclear war that go with it is regarded as evidence of fascism or fanaticism or right-wing extremism. It's just the thing that dominates all of Western politics somehow now, is pledging support for the war in Ukraine and the NATO war that seems to be an endless war. All right, let's look at one last question that she asked, because I think it's so illustrative of how this discourse is so distorted.
In this conflict.
Final question. The fact that your party did so well in the European elections, and so did Giorgia Meloni's party, and so did AFD. I mean, AFD, as you know, a little bit like the former National Front, is very scary. The fact that the far right is becoming a very, very powerful force in Europe, and who knows, maybe now, with all that's going on in the United States, Donald Trump might win a second term. How do you see Europe changing?
First of all, I strongly dispute the term far-right, which in your country refers to small groups that are extremely radical and violent. If you like, the equivalent...
You don't think you're far-right?
The equivalent of what we are in the United States is between the centre-right and the centre-left with regards to ideas. So I think this...
You're kidding me, right?
Yes.
What kind of comment is that for a journalist? Oh, you're kidding me, right? With her hands folded and her just smarmy expression on her face. This is designed to say that we have put you in this category called far right, and I don't even have to make an argument as to why you belong there. In fact, any attempt by you to say we're not actually in this extremist category is just going to provoke this kind of scoffing from me, because I know that's all I need to tell my audience that you're crazy in what you're saying. It's just such a bizarre way to conduct an interview. This person that you've asked a question to explains her position, and you interrupt and do nothing other than say, you're kidding me, right? Because you know that the CNN audience already has been convinced that Marine Le Pen deserves this title, far right. Listen to the rest of this.
Yes, I'm telling you very honestly, I think this use of the term far right carries a stigma and is very pejorative. It does not correspond to what we are, and not at all to what the far right is in the United States. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, we can't put everyone in the same boat. For example, in Europe, we distanced ourselves from the AFD party because we're in total disagreement with a number of their statements. So together with Mrs. Meloni, and with our differences too, are what we call patriots. In other words, we defend the existence and the power of nations within the European Union, because nations are the expression of the French people.
Ce sont celles qui sont l'expression du peuple français.
When the European Union takes on certain roles without consulting anyone, it is no longer democratic. We are defenders of nations. We want a Europe of nations, a Europe that respects the decisions of the people and not a super technocratic structure such as it exists today. And that's the path that we want to follow. A Europe of nations that's respectful, that leads projects, a Europe that doesn't restrict, that doesn't threaten, that doesn't blackmail when it comes to subsidies. Because that's not our vision. Our Europe is the Europe of Airbus. Forgive me, it's a competitor. It's the Europe of Ariane. It's not the Europe of Madame von der Leyen. And so we will fight within Europe to redirect Europe in the direction that we want.
Now, the reason why I think that exchange is so telling is because, to me, this really does define modern-day politics. I think the president of the EU, this unelected technocrat, Ursula von der Leyen, is the embodiment of establishment politics. You can find other people like at Davos and other places, but to me, she is the kind of living, breathing embodiment of what establishment politics is. There's no democratic electability to her. She has no support within the people of the countries that form the EU only within the elite halls in Paris and Berlin and other European capitals. And her politics is one of allegiance to the neoliberalism of the international order, to massive international institutions that are far removed from anything that the people who are ruled by them believe in or have any say in. It's why the UK left the EU, because they didn't want to be governed by these distant, unelected technocrats in Brussels. And if you look at the requirements of what is deemed to be necessary to be an establishment politician, support for the NATO war, allegiance to these superstructures like the World Bank and the IMF and the EU and all of these conglomerates of concentrated power that have a very establishment ideology, of course those factions have succeeded in saying anyone who dissents from our ideology, anyone who declares their independence from our control and power, we're going to deem a far right or far left radical. And that's why you had Jeremy Corbyn in the EU, who, although he abandoned it when he was the leader of the Labour Party, clearly had a history of favoring Brexit and was very tepid in his support for staying in Brexit, which he had to do as the leader of the Labour Party. But left-wing politics in the EU, including in France, is very hostile to Brussels, and so are these populist parties, these nationalist parties on the right, who are saying, we want to govern ourselves as France, not as under the rule of Ursula von der Leyen and the other unelected officials in Brussels. And you can find that on the left and the right in Europe. You can find that on the left and the right in the United States, and that's so clearly part of the reason why I believe that our modern day politics is not really well defined by left versus right or conservative versus liberal in any of these traditional senses, but far more by whether you pledge allegiance to and believe in the dominant ideology of establishment factions or whether you oppose them. And I think what all of these elections are showing is that more and more people are disgusted by that establishment ideology, don't believe these establishment factions have their best interests at heart. A lot of them just respond by removing themselves from the political system altogether and not voting. But when there are elections, what you see, again, sometimes more gradually, sometimes more abruptly, depending on the election, is a constantly and rapidly growing contempt for this establishment ideology that Christine Amanpour is there defending and trying to label Marine Le Pen as a far-right extremist because of her refusal to accept it. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.